a complete breakdown of democracy, you want to look at what this coalition has done with the NHS. And, you know, if David Cameron is smiling at us, it's because we all like to be smiled at while we're being screwed. And he is screwing the NHS majorly at the moment. So we wrote a book published 18 months ago called NHS SOS, in which we described the betrayal of the NHS by the coalition. And the people we fingered for that betrayal were the politicians, of course, in particular the Lib Dems, who allowed this to happen, because it couldn't have happened without them. We fingered the media, who, as Phil said, were completely lazy and off the ball about questioning what had happened when Langley brought his big reforms in. And I'm afraid we fingered too my own profession, or the leaders of my profession, who didn't understand or were complicit in allowing these reforms to go through and not fighting them hard enough. We just published another book, which I'm going to hold up, and so I'll go off screen for a moment. Okay, NHS for Sale came out last month. It does two things. It explains all the lies that they're telling about the NHS, which I can talk about a little bit, and it also explains how the NHS is being privatised, why we don't want it privatised, and tells a little bit about what we can do about it. So privatisation is advancing apace with the NHS, and of course it's a very toxic concept for the politicians. The NHS is at the top of the voters' concerns, quite rightly, because they have made a complete mess of it, and they're lying about it at the moment, and one of the lies they're telling us is they're not privatising it. And they confuse voters by saying it's still free at the point of delivery. Being free at the point of delivery does not exclude it being privatised. Privatisation is simply the increased sale of or outsourcing of public services to the private sector, and that's what we're seeing with the NHS at the moment. Those of us who campaign for the NHS would never say there should be no involvement of the private sector. You know, where the NHS can't do things, we're not so ideologically committed that we would say patients should suffer because we don't like the private sector. And the private sector has always had a peripheral role in the NHS, but not on the competitive basis that we're seeing it at the moment. Why do we think privatisation is bad? Well, how much time have you got? I'm just going to list a few things. I hope this is going to be really a Q&A session, because I've just got off an 11-hour plane flight. I'm feeling a bit confused and tired. So if I go through all the reasons why privatisation is a bad thing, then perhaps we could have a Q&A about it afterwards. First of all, in order to privatise the health service, they have had to create a marketplace in the English NHS. And bear in mind that this does not exist in Scotland or Wales, because they have rejected this path. And the way they've created a marketplace in the English NHS is to talk about giving us all choice. And that choice, which Tony Blair was very big on, we all want choice in the NHS, has been the Trojan horse for introducing private companies to deliver NHS care. The reality is that the more these private companies come in, the less choice we get, because as the House of Commons Health Select Committee remarked themselves, these people, these private companies, they don't like choice. What they want is large quasi-monopolies, and we'll end up with 2 or 3 big companies like United Health and Virgin and Serco, people like that, all in a cosy little conflab running the NHS. So the whole concept of choice is nonsense. But what we've seen in creating a market is the compulsory tendering. So GPs now have to put all services out to tender. And I was speaking to a friend of mine from the East End. They have a service down there. They spent £40,000 on tendering for their own services and lost. So how much money, multiply that around the country, how much money do you think is being wasted? Not to mention clinicians' time. There was an absolutely tragic blog, which is mentioned in the book, written by somebody who ran a sexual health clinic. He had to take 3 months off to tender for his own services. And if patients understood that doctors' and nurses' time is being wasted by the day and the week and the month in writing contracts for services that they then lose to the private sector, because a lot of contracts are going to the private sector at the moment, and guess why? Their expertise is in winning private contracts. They have the lawyers, they have the deep pockets, and they have the expertise. And when they win those contracts, they have never delivered those services before. So you have got people like Virgin and Serco stepping up and winning contracts for services that they have never delivered. And then guess what? They have to start asking the NHS to lend them staff to do it. That's how awful it is. It stops cooperation because the competition law says that we can't cooperate with each other, so hospitals who want to work with each other can't do it anymore. Thousands of pounds were wasted recently when two hospitals wanted to merge and the local private hospital challenged it. It's an absolute nightmare, and even David Nicholson, who was the Chief Executive Officer of the NHS while all this was happening, said that this is an absolute field day for competition lawyers now, who of course cost a great deal of money to employ their services. Patients don't have power as we were promised. If any of you followed the Lewisham debacle, in Lewisham they tried to close down the local hospital. People rose up. I like to wave my hands around when I speak and I can't do it. Somebody was just... okay. Thanks, that's good. Somebody was just talking about this is real democracy. Well, we are the real big society, but when the real big society gets out there and challenges them, they really don't like it. So when the people of Lewisham took to the streets in their tens of thousands to say we don't want our hospital closed, and that was all a PFI disaster, I haven't even got time to go into that, Jeremy Hunt took them to court. That was how much people's voice there is, and he took them to court twice, and when he lost, he changed the law so it couldn't happen again. So that's how much democracy there is about what's going on in the NHS at the moment. The private sector, of course, are there to make a profit. That's their raison d'etre. If they can't in the NHS, they walk away. We've seen Hinchingbrook Hospital, where they had a private contract. They've walked out after three years into a 10-year contract because they can't make any money. They're doing the same in primary care. The other thing about these people is they aren't ethical. Do you remember the breast implant scandal? You know, when it was discovered that breast implants made in France were actually made of industrial-grade silicone instead of medical-grade silicone, and a lot of those have been put in privately in this country, and when women went back to those private people and said, you know, we want something done about it, they changed their names. They changed the names of their companies so they couldn't be sued. You know, we've seen Serco falsifying data. They are not ethical. There may be many problems with the NHS, but by and large the staff behave in ethical ways. They're not transparent. We can't find out what they're doing. Even Margaret Hodge across the road, who chairs the Health Select Committee, said, we don't know what their costs are, we don't know what their profits are, and we don't know what their outcomes are because it's all commercially confidential. And they are now starting to run the NHS behind the NHS logo. You won't even know that it's them delivering the service to you, and we don't know how much money they're making out of us the taxpayers who are paying for that service, and what their outcomes are. And a colleague of mine has just published a paper showing 800 unexpected deaths in private hospitals delivering NHS care, and he had to go away and do that as a piece of research because he can bet the government isn't telling us about it. So the private sector shouldn't be delivering the NHS unless we invite them in to do it, and the problem is that in order to create the market that has allowed them to get in and deliver NHS care, it has completely destabilised the whole of the health service. And if you've been following the NHS debate, you will have seen that entire services have been outsourced, like the dermatology service up in Nottingham, where they gave it to Circle who've already made a mess of Hinchingbrook Hospital, and the local doctors just all walked out and said we're not working for them. So the dermatology services have been lost in that hospital. In other places, they've outsourced the musculoskeletal services, and the local hospital have said, we can't run our A&E service if you take away the musculoskeletal services because we won't have a trauma service here. So you cannot break up the NHS like a pile of Jenga blocks, just keep pulling the profitable bits out, the whole lot's going to fall over in the end. So privatisation is happening, it's real. The figures that are quoted by the government are completely bogus. Because the fact of the matter is that the private sector does not want to run all of the NHS. They only want to run the profitable bits of the NHS. And the profitable bits of the NHS are elective, that is planned care, mental health services, community services. They do not want the expensive stuff. So they'll try and grab that, but they're destabilising the rest of the NHS, which will always have to provide the core services, the acute services for us, and we will all need the NHS. Hands up here who's never needed the NHS. Yeah, I thought so. Never. Congratulations, that man.
No, but my family uses
You know that
buying everybody a drink.
They will all need it afterwards. You know, the NHS, the other big lie they've told us about the NHS, just to finish with, is that it's an expensive, failing service. The NHS is one of the most successful and cost-efficient health services in the world, and they have managed to change it. They have managed to change it by telling us that it was failing. So this book is full of all the lies they've told us and why they're wrong. I encourage you to read it if you're interested.
They're putting all the money into the military.
It wasn't broke, it didn't need fixing. And we've got a real job now to wrestle it back from them. I don't think that Labour are much better than the Conservatives, but quite frankly, if I've got to fight one or the other, I'd rather be fighting Labour than fight the Tories, because if the Tories get back in again, for 5 years, we will lose the health service. That's it, full stop. And once it's lost, it's like Humpty Dumpty. It's really easy to break it up. It'll be really difficult to put it back together again. So I urge everybody here to think about voting for the NHS. If you've got a National Health Action Party person, I'm friends with them, but I'm not part of them, vote for them. Go home and tell 10 people that we are going to lose the health service if the Tories get back in. Thank you.
We got the NHS.
Does anybody, Rob and Phoenix and Gail?
Invisible man. Can't see you on the live stream.
Hello? There we go, right. It's a two-part question. You said 800 people had died unexpectedly in the private sector. Firstly, is there a frame of reference for that? So it's like today or past year, decade? And secondly, is there a relation, like something I can relate that to? So how many have unexpectedly died in the National Health Service? Otherwise it's just an arbitrary figure. Thank you.
We take 3 questions.
Okay, the work was done by a very interesting left-wing, or at least let's say progressive think tank. And you'll hear from Tamsin later, he's coming to talk about lobbying. All the think tanks who call themselves neutral, you know, the kind of policy think tank and all the rest of it, they've all been captured by corporations. These guys are actually good guys. They're called CHPI, if you're interested, CHPI. They're the Centre for Health Policy something or other. Anyway, they're good, they're progressive, and they published the work by a professor called Professor Callum. Ooh, can't remember. It's in the book. If you're interested, I'll look for you afterwards. And it was 800 unexpected deaths over the deaths they would have anticipated. And the 2 important things about that were as follows. One is that unless they had done the work, we wouldn't know anything about it. And when they talk about patient choice, one of the things you'd like to know is the hospital I'm going to go into more likely to kill me? And since you can now choose to go into a private hospital to have your NHS care, that's a very important piece of information for patients, and they simply didn't have it. Over the time frame, I'm not quite sure what time frame they looked at it over, but we have now got private hospitals delivering NHS care to NHS patients. And one of the problems with these private hospitals is because it is expensive to run emergency services and ITUs and high dependency units and to have junior staff on call at night, they often don't have those things. And there was a very sad case about, I don't know, a couple of years ago of a doctor who was an NHS patient, but he was operated on in an independent sector treatment centre run by the private sector.